I'm going to tell you about a game that came out about 15 years ago. It played like a mix between Supreme Commander and Dawn of War. It had a number of new refreshing features. It was both innovative and true to its roots. It had excellent multiplayer. It felt like a breath of fresh air, and it was an appropriate ending for such a huge franchise. Hi, I'm Calivan, and today we're going to talk about game reviews and their scores, the inherent problems with the system, and try to understand why some of the output just doesn't make a great deal of sense. In case you hadn't figured it out yet, the comments in my intro were all taken from reviews of 2010's Command & Conquer 4 Tiberium Twilight. I picked this game for a reason. I think it's one of those strategy titles that's almost universally disliked. It's not the worst RTS ever made, but it's bad. Not just as a standalone title, but also compared to its peers, to the other games in the series, and the quality you should expect with a full-price game from one of the major studios. So what's with all of that praise and those scores in the 80s? Were the reviewers paid off by the publishers? Did they all get brand new sports cars with the EA logo on? Most certainly didn't, and if you look at the majority of the reviews, then they were far less kind. I'm pretty sure Alex Roth at Gaming Target didn't get a new set of wheels, but he did manage to sum up all of our feelings pretty well with his final 3 words on the subject. Kane deserved better. Now, I'm going to ask you to put a lot of your preconceptions aside. There is a general feeling that the whole review thing is corrupt through and through, and none of the words you read or the scores you see are anything other than bought and paid for. However, if we're going to have a sensible grown-up discussion about this topic, then I think we need to approach it with an open mind. Even if we could objectively show that AAA game scores are increasing at the same rate as game reviewer perks or bonuses, it wouldn't prove any relation. Remember, correlation isn't necessarily causation. Just because two things appear to be related, it doesn't prove that the link between them is what you think it might be, nor does it prove that they're even linked in the first place. If I told you that the black line here was the average worth of a video game reviewer, and the red line was the average review score of a AAA game, you might immediately jump to the conclusion that there is a link between them, and assume that link is somewhat underhanded. It might just be coincidence, or that graphs tend to trend upwards, or a million other things. This graph is actually the number of master's degrees awarded in journalism plotted against the solar power generated in Malta. They correlate, but that does not mean they causate. The truth is that there aren't any public metrics of scores against salaries, bonuses, bribes, perks or threats, so we have to ask ourselves, why do we feel this way in the first place? Secondly, we have to acknowledge Hitchen's razor. That is, what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. An anonymous poster might claim that reviewers are often offered incentives for tuning up scores, but without any specifics, we shouldn't feel the need to provide any proof to the contrary to dismiss those claims out of hand. Since we can't prove or disprove very general statements or accusations, instead we're going to talk about 6 things that may cause a review to appear inaccurate or unfair, and then we're going to look at a bit of data and see if there's anything us gamers can do to correct for this.
This brings me neatly to the first thing that is likely to make a review seem out of place. The reviewer isn't you. Nor are they probably in one of your social circles that you formed based on common views and interests and understandings. Art is subjective and people are different, and although we expect a reviewer to be totally objective about a game, that's just not possible. I've got friends who love the films, music, TV and games that I can't stand. And some of the things I love they find boring or frustrating in equal measures.
Video game journalists aren't necessarily plugged into the same niche that you are, and as such they will often put a lot less weight on certain aspects that may be of critical importance to you. I don't want to spend too long on this first point as it seems kind of obvious, but evidence of this is everywhere you look. People don't actively decide if they enjoy something or not, they just do or they don't. Professional critics have training and experience to mitigate this somewhat, but they are not immune to these feelings. This is why people often find themselves drawn towards particular critics, publications or channels. It's not just because that source is a unique bastion of common sense and objectivity, it's because everyone has bias, but that particular place shares a similar bias to you, and as such you're more likely to enjoy the games that they recommend.
The second thing we should talk about can be summed up in a single word: time. Unlike movies or music, where it's pretty obvious that the reviewer needs to watch the whole film or listen to the whole track, There is no industry standard duration for a game or the amount of time someone should spend before they are able to pass judgment upon it. This is a problem in two parts. How much time does it take for you to be able to properly understand a game? And how long should you be able to play a game before you get bored of it? This is especially tricky when you're talking about AAA games that go big on the spectacle but then place you in pretty repetitive gameplay loops egged on by level ups and unlocks. You could easily play the game for 10 hours and be blown away by the graphics, animations, sounds and sights and story, but if you played it for 30 hours, then you might notice that a lot of what's impressive only goes skin deep, and there are a whole lot of gameplay problems under the hood.
I have literally thousands of hours in some of my most played games, and I'm sure you do too, but you can't expect any reviewer to spend anything like that amount of time on them. Maybe you think the reviewer should at least complete the single player campaign, but what if it takes over 100 hours? That's a full-time job for 3 weeks before you've even put pen to paper or cursor to screen. What if the game's heavily focused on the multiplayer? It can take a pretty long time to become competent and fully understand all of the interactions, something that I doubt most reviewers have time for. This is just one of the many failings of the system itself, and when you're reading a review you need to remember that. It's not a complete, total and full breakdown of the entire gameplay experience, it's a mix of overview and first impressions. Intricate and detailed deep dives do exist, but you often won't find them until many weeks after the release date, and they'll probably be from a YouTube creator rather than a professional reviewer at a gaming publication.
The third problem is one of baseline. When you're looking at a score or reading a review, what is it in relation to? There are games from the 90s that got an amazing write-up when they were released, but if you published one of those today for $75, it would be trashed by all and sundry for the graphics, sounds and interface. Games have evolved, as has what we look for in one. Does this mean that reviews are only applicable compared to the other games released in the previous year or two? And how do you even define that amount of time? If you give a game 5 out of 10, are you saying that it sits at an exact midpoint between the best game of all time and the worst game to be released? And what does that even mean? IGN explains their scores. For them, a 5 out of 10 means that it's a forgettable game that isn't worth your time and money if those things are precious to you. But that's worth unpacking a little. Money might not matter to some, but time generally does. And even if you do have plenty of time, there are so many games released, there's no point playing a bad one when you could play something better.
It's also worth thinking about cost and value for money. Does a $60 game need to be twice as good as a $30 game to get a similar review? Or does it just need to be the same quality but take twice as long to complete? What about expectations? If a small indie developer and a AAA studio both produce a game of identical quality and length, should it get an identical score and review even if one was $60 and one was $10? I realise that the previous paragraph contained a great deal of questions and very few answers, but that's part of the issue. So much of this stuff is subjective. There's so much variation between individual publications, the games they are reviewing and what matters to them. It's not like reviewing a fridge freezer where you can objectively measure things like cost, features and energy efficiency. The fourth problem we face from reviews is one of conflict of interest. This is a particularly thorny subject, but I want to stress that it is in no way specific to game reviews, and is a feature of the relationship between the art and the critic that has existed way before Alan Alcorn first ponged between two paddles. In a nutshell, it's all about access. To be able to review or critique something, you need to be able to experience it in the first place. To compete with other critics, you need your own feelings to be published around the same time as the others and before the public release of the product in question. It's just like any sort of journalism. There is huge value to being one of the first to break the story, and if you arrive with the same information but a week late, most people won't give it a look. The conflict in question is that the publisher of the content is also the provider of access to the content. The critic has a vested interest in keeping the particular studio sweet, as if they make a habit of unsettling them, then they might find that they're invited to less previews and given fewer promo copies to write about. The difficulty with this sort of relationship is you don't actually need any intentional, nefarious decisions or direct threats to take place for it to have a notable effect on the output of the reviewer. It's unlikely that an upstanding professional critic will be completely and intentionally dishonest about a game in question, but it's quite possible they will subconsciously find themselves being a little less harsh in their phrasing and a little kinder with their overall summary because of it. It's just like the press pool of journalists that line up to question a politician. They might find that if they pull their punches, they get selected a little more often, and as such they get more column inches and more coverage because of it. I think this particular fact has become more prominent in recent years, partly due to the decline of traditional media, the rise of user-submitted reviews, and an overabundance of amateur, semi-professional and professional reviewers on places like YouTube. In the days of past, the critic was something to be respected. There were a hell of a lot less of them for one thing. People recognised some of them by name, and a few would be both feared and respected by any studio, no matter if that studio was peddling games, films or music. Their individual opinions mattered a lot, and as such the power dynamic was a little different. Instead of a critic or reviewer holding a subconscious fear of upsetting a studio and losing access, the studio could be the ones fearful of upsetting the critic. The fifth topic I want to touch on is one of studio meddling. Now I'm going to tread a bit carefully here, as I'm not a fan of using hearsay or passing off assumptions as fact. Just because a particular game scored or sold better or worse than we think it should have, it doesn't prove that it was the result of any one single thing. We have to acknowledge that one of the biggest single factors in the perception of a game and its sales numbers is marketing. In 2023 there was a mobile game released called Monopoly Go, and it pulled in $1 billion in revenue in the first 6 months. Was this because it was the most amazing mobile game ever released, with rave reviews from users and critics alike? No, it's because it was pretty fun, but also because they spent $500 million on advertising it. It turns out that you can't really separate video game perceptions from our perceptions of anything else that's affected by the modern world. Trust in well-known gaming websites and publications is pretty low these days, but you can make a similar claim about any sort of reporting, whether it covers entertainment, art, current events, politics, culture or economics. You'll probably respect a few creators and outlets and have mixed levels of disdain for the rest. But studios have been exposed for a bit of meddling along the way. When a game journalist goes on record and publishes their name against a story, I'm happy to consider that reliable information unless I have evidence to the contrary. Kian Mayer published an article back in 2020 on the back of the release of Cyberpunk 2077, explaining why the review scores were pretty high and tended to overlook a lot of the game's defects. He states that all of the review copies his organisation was provided were for the PC. CD Projekt told them that the console copies were coming later, but implied they wouldn't have enough time to play the game through and write their reviews if they waited for them. If we assume that this was the case for all of the reviewers, then it explains why none of the huge defects experienced by many console owners were mentioned. No secret backroom deals, no envelope stuffed full of cash passed under the table, just a sneaky studio finding a morally questionable way to present the best version possible as the average experience, which it was not. The sixth thing I want to touch on is one up from Meddling, and I think we can just call it bad practice. This includes corruptions, bribes, threats, backhanders and other such things that totally and without question forever ruin the reputation and impartiality of a reviewer or publication. So we can properly approach this topic, I've collected a list of all of the instances of outright immoral practice that have been highlighted by the game journalists themselves or whistleblowers within the publication or studios that have been part of these deals. I've not limited my search to cases that have been proven in a court of law, just anything reported by a primary source that's had enough conviction to attach their name to it. So on the left here we've got a list of years starting from 2000 and going up to 2024, and on the right a list of incidents that are worth our time and investigation. Let me load them in now. And there you go. Once you discard all of the anonymous and unverified reports, suppositions and theories, there is a single solitary case from 2007. It's still worth discussing as it definitely did happen, so let me give you the details. There is an editor and writer working for Gamespot called Jeff Gertzman. He doesn't like it there. The publication has some new higher level management that don't really understand what the company is about and why editorial integrity is so important. He's planning to leave the company on his own accord, but not just yet, and he wants to see a few things through before he does. He has several arguments with his new management team. His team have written some unfavourable reviews about some games, notably Ratchet & Clank, but the publisher behind that game is actually giving GameSpot a lot of money to advertise on their site. That publisher complains, either directly or indirectly hinting they may pull said advertising if the company isn't a bit kinder about their products. The suits in upper management complain to Jeff about this, but he quite rightly holds his ground, stating the importance of separating editorial decisions from managerial ones. I get the impression that this wasn't the only title that Gamespot reviewed that caused similar complaints, but it's the only one specifically mentioned. That is Until Kane and Lynch, a review that Jeff writes himself. The marketing team behind the game take issue with this and complain to the Gamespot management. I'm not sure if they spoke with their words or just let their money do the talking, but either way the Kane and Lynch adverts disappeared from the site. Jeff is once again called in for some stern words by the management team, but as before he holds his ground. The issue appears to be over, but a couple of weeks later Jeff is once again summoned and this time dismissed. It appears that the management team cared not for editorial integrity and they lost their bottle when an income stream was threatened. There is additional but important background to this, something revealed by Jeff himself in a later interview. Gamespot had recently changed how they calculated their scores. They used to use a mathematical formula where the results of several different aspects would be added up and then modified by the reviewer's overall impression with a final figure presented as a marks out of 10. But the new system had no formula and was just a score handpicked by the reviewer. As a result of this change, new scores generally dropped by a full point across the board. I think it's also worth noting that the originally published review of Kane and Lynch is pretty harsh and I don't think it even really matches the score attached. It gets a 6 out of 10, which Gamespot classes as fair, 1 below good and 1 above mediocre. In the original opening paragraph, Jeff states that the game is ugly, features unlikable characters with no redeeming value whatsoever, has a messy, meaningless story, has clunky artificial intelligence, and a core shooting mechanic that simply doesn't satisfy. The reason this stands out to me is it just wasn't Jeff's style. His previous reviews for other titles that score in the 5 to 7 range all start with a descriptive opener that sets the scene rather than passes judgment upon it. I just don't think it's a good example of his usual high quality, and it does have a whiff that there was something a little more behind it. He's planning on leaving the company anyway. He's had several bust-ups with his managers about keeping the advertisers happy, and he sees the Gamespot website plastered with adverts for what he thinks is a substandard game. Did he subconsciously press a little to see what would happen? I don't know, but he's only human after all. There is clear fault here, but it's not Jeff, but nor is it Eidos or any of the other publishers that might have complained. As a business, you can spend your advertising budget where you wish, and if you feel like a certain publication isn't giving your products a fair chance, then you don't have to continue to fund them. The fault lies with the upper management team at Gamespot. They buckled under pressure and fired their editor instead of sticking to well-established journalistic principles. If it was just a case of the quality of Jeff's output, then there are proper ways to handle that, and summary dismissal is not one of them. In doing so, they junked the credibility of their publication, which probably led to a loss of far greater revenue in the future. Remember, the marketing team at Eidos didn't threaten to pull their ads if Gamespot didn't act, they just pulled their ads full stop. This isn't as much a story about game publishers threatening the gaming press, it's about the importance of a good management team that does not get involved in editorial decisions.
Gamespot didn't have that, and as a result they suffered. This wasn't business as usual, this was a huge embarrassment. Other staff left, the management team was moved on, and a lot of the trust and respect that Gamespot had earned over the years all went down the drain. But aside from this single case 16 years ago, I can't find anything else that comes to light of a similar nature.
There are rumours of course, and other accusations, and I've seen some really wild claims. I read one the other day that claimed gaming sites were bribed with paid vacations, monetary gifts and I quote, high-profile prostitutes in exchange for favourable reviews.
However, all of these reports are anonymous. None of them list any specific instances and therefore they cannot be corroborated. As such, we can completely ignore them without any further investigation. Remember what the hitch says. What can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. It's also worth asking if you really want a high-profile prostitute from a secret deal. You would think that a low-profile prostitute would be far more suitable.
I don't think that these people are all corrupt, and I don't think that video game journalism has any specific problems that aren't present in journalism as a whole. There is a whole myriad of problems with the links between outlets, their audiences and their advertisers, but these are in no way unique to this market sector. It's likely that game reviews are written from a point of view that aligns with the perceived values of their target market, but in our modern media age, what isn't? Totally factual and completely unbiased sources do exist out there, but they don't get a lot of clicks, so you'll mostly only find them in areas where big money isn't involved. In this man's personal opinion, the problem isn't so much with the content of the review, but the score that's attached to it. More than anything else, the score is the headline. It's what's plastered on the store pages, it's all over the advertising, it's what's combined into Metacritic, and if you only remember one thing about a review, it will be the overall score. These scores don't sit right with me, but the difficulty here is there isn't a huge data list of strategy games and their scores somewhere that I can examine to investigate my own theories. But hang on, I'm a software developer and a database guy. So let's find a nice easy list of some strategy games to copy. Wikipedia has one for RTS, one for real-time tactics and one for grand strategy. Cool, let's pop all those into a spreadsheet and convert it to a CSV. Now we can create a table to hold all of this data, and write a seed to populate it. Now it's time to get some scores, so let's loop through our table and search the Metacritic site for some average review scores. Thankfully, Metacritic uses a pretty simple system to decide the URL based on the name of the game, so we can replicate that to get the web data. Then we use a simple bit of something called regex to look for the score and then insert it into our database. Because we're a good-natured developer, we'll put a limiter on this so we only do a handful of requests to Metacritic per minute so we don't spam their servers. Now that's done, we've got a lovely database full of strategy titles and their respective scores. It's a bit rough and ready, but it should suffice for a really quick overview. So let's use something called SQL to ask our database how many games we have that have got a score attached. 631. Nice. Although we just want Windows games, so let's filter for that. 585, even better. Now let's remove anything that had a PS2 or a PS3 port, as those were normally pretty dire and tended to skew review scores down. 562, still a good number. 562 Windows strategy games released between 2000 and 2020 that were noteworthy enough for someone to enter them on Wikipedia. I wonder how many had scores above 50. 535, very interesting. In that 20-year period, from all of the Metacritic scores, only 27 of our strategy games scored below 50. We really do have to ask ourselves a question. Is a game with an average score below 50 even worth considering? What's the point of giving games a score between 1 and 100 if less than 5% of them occupy an area below the midpoint? Is it really helpful for us gamers if a review has a score of 13 or 24 or 1 or 2 out of 10? No review with a score like that is going to persuade someone to try a game, so why are they even bothering? If you look at most scoring systems, 8 or higher is a different sort of great, 7 is good, 6 is okay but not without problems, and 5 is mediocre. The definition of the word mediocre means of average quality, but this just doesn't stack up with what we're seeing. If we've got a list of over 550 games, how can 500 of them be above average? That's not what average means. Let's plot these scores on a graph, divided by 10 and rounded up to the nearest whole number. We can see that this bottom part of the graph is totally useless to us, and hardly anything ever lands over here. We can also see this big chunk at the top is more useful, but because of the lower numbers exist, it skews our perception of everything above them. Let's imagine we did something a little different. First, we'll start off by just subtracting a flat 50 from every average score. Then we'll divide by 10, and if anything is 0 or below, we'll just fix it at 0. This gives us a far better distribution and something we could actually work with. If a game gets a 0, it's not worth playing. If it gets a 1, it might be fun for a few hours, but it's not worth paying for. 2 and 3 are average games, not amazing, but probably worth the money and depending on personal preference, potentially quite enjoyable. 4 is reserved for great games that are well worth playing, and 5 is the absolute best of the best. Is there really any need to be more granular than that? This would move Tiberium Twilight from here to here, and I think we could all agree that that makes a hell of a lot of sense. As strategy gamers, I think we're a little luckier than some due to the fact our interests generally lie in a niche genre. This means that the games we buy often aren't subject to the massive multi-million-dollar marketing campaigns that plague the more general audience titles. Because of this, the reviewers we follow are going to be less prone to unconscious bias from a fear of losing access, and there is a far less chance of studio meddling. They can't lie about the console version if there isn't one. I've not really touched on user-submitted reviews, as this is a whole subject unto itself. Unlike professional critics, users tend to be very binary when it comes to their output. It's either great or terrible, and probably why Steam's choice to stick to a system that's either positive or negative is a smart choice. User reviews can be really helpful, but they are often very much influenced by marketing, social pressures or popular content creators, and as such can't be judged as any more or less reliable than any other sort of feedback.
I think professional reviewers still have value, and unless I'm presented with real evidence to the contrary, then I have a reasonable amount of faith in their honesty and integrity. What I don't agree with are the popular scoring methods, and I think trying to break a game experience down into percentage points or even a mark out of 10 is still a fruitless exercise due to the inherent flaws in the system. For me, games are either terrible, bad, okay, good, great or amazing, and any attempt to surmise them numerically with any more variation than that is just going to end up with what we already have.
If there is a conspiracy involving professional reviews at work, I feel like it's the scoring system itself. Do the numbers 1 to 5 or 0 to 50 only exist to make people who would normally get a 0 feel better about their terrible game? I think these low numbers might just be a safety net for bad studios. Something to keep their spirits up before the inevitable cascade failure of their organisation. What a cheerful note to end on.
Hi there, thanks for listening to me rant about review scores for the last 20 minutes. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button, and if you've got something to add, then leave a comment or come say hi on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.